Thank you, Sherman. Thank you, Kelsey, Maggie, and everyone else that I've met this evening for this award and for being here. It's really an honor to receive an award that celebrates Bory's life. After Acer told me about this award, I went online to learn a little bit more about this young woman and her life, and I was really struck by the memories that people left about her on the IGL website. A lot of very heartfelt messages are there, and the two themes that sort of continued through all of those messages, and I heard Sherman and Bruce talk a little bit about them tonight, was her serious attention and focus to what she was doing here and what she wanted to do in her future to apply the skills that she had learned here. But at the same time, everyone kept talking about her smile and her incredibly warm personality, and I thought that was incredible. It's just such a great pairing of traits. It really demonstrates that you can pour yourself into your vocation and be very serious about what you want to do, but without losing your humanity. And I think, in fact, what can sometimes be seen as a weakness, that warmth, that smile, that is a great strength. And I've found that I've been more effective in my work when I've also tried to be a compassionate, warm, friendly human being. So I would hope that all of you guys would take that lesson from Bory and be serious about what you want to commit your life to, but also have fun and connect with people and be a compassionate human being. The website also quoted from Bory's presentation at IGL in 2004. She was introducing EPIC and the symposium to people who maybe didn't know the phenomenon that EPIC is. So she was describing it, and she said, EPIC is an acronym that stands for interesting, overwhelming, challenging, eclectic, thoughtful, diverse, practical, and a million other adjectives. For every single EPIC student, this class has an intrinsically different meaning, and that's the beauty of it. What holds it all together is love and passion. Passion for knowledge, awareness, intervention, application of theory and experience in an effort to bring about a positive result. And I read that, I felt like she and I had very similar experiences at EPIC, and so I wish I had been able to talk about that with her. But I also felt like that description, at least for me, describes Tufts as well. And that's one of the things I loved about my 4 years here, is that for such a small school, you've got people studying all sorts of things. And my best friends were a chemical engineer, an IR major, and a couple geologists. I was a political science major. And we were all thrown in together and taking each other's classes and hearing what each other was learning about. And I think you're just exposed to a lot of really different experiences, different people, different ethnic backgrounds, different points of view here, and that's all really encouraged. And it's just a wonderful time. So I hope you're all enjoying it. The bad news is you only get to stay for 4 years, but the good news is you can take it with you. And that's what I was going to talk about tonight. Since graduating from Tufts 19 years ago, I've worked on environmental issues from a number of different perspectives. I've been a community organizer, I've been a litigator at the Department of Justice, I've been a Hill staffer, I've been an AmeriCorps member, probably other things that I'm not remembering here, but I've seen this issue from a lot of different sides. And throughout my career, I've found allies in what I took to be really unlikely places. So from my experience and given where we are now on environmental issues, I really believe we need thought leaders in all walks of life. And so I'm challenging everyone here that you should be practicing environmental stewardship and incorporating its principles into everything you do, regardless of the paths you take out of Tufts and into the world. We need to incorporate environmental sustainability into laws, business practices, curricula, medical research, and our communities. Since the focus of this award and this evening is corporate social responsibility, I'm going to focus my remarks on sort of things I've seen through my career about how to work with or for corporate sustainability. But there are a lot of other unlikely allies and corners of this field where you can make a lot of progress. I've attempted to sort of weave two themes through my comments. One is that you should go out and do whatever it is you want to do. You've got to be passionate about your work. But wherever you go, you've got to incorporate environmental sustainability. And that really is our only hope, is to incorporate that and make that just a normal way of doing business in all walks of life. And the second is if you do choose to work in a more traditional environmental path like I have, you're going to have to build alliances with non-traditional allies and understand the frameworks in which they operate if you really want to find sustainable long-term solutions to our environmental challenges. And those are very large challenges. I'm going to touch very briefly on these challenges. I'd rather not spend a lot of time on them because for the most part we know about them, and I think we need to spend more time talking about paths forward. But on the challenges, sort of 3 points to make. One, we're losing ground on environmental indicators, and this is not to ignore all the great work that a lot of people are doing around the world on these issues, but the challenges are coming at us faster than we're devising solutions. So I just wanted to throw out a few statistics to sort of illustrate my point and move on. One on greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists suggest that to avoid the truly catastrophic consequences of climate change, we probably need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by global greenhouse gas emissions 60% from 1990 levels by 2050. And industrialized countries like the United States need to drop 80% from 1990 levels. So our emissions have been dropping in recent years, but last year our emissions were still 10% higher than 1990 levels. And globally, global greenhouse gas emissions are 45% higher than 1990 levels. So not only are we not making progress on that, we're really falling backwards. Chemicals, there's an estimated 80,000 chemicals in common use in the global market and about 700 new chemicals that come on the US market every year. EPA has written rules under the Federal Toxic Substances Control Act requiring testing of 200 chemicals total since that law came into effect in the late 1970s. So there's a lot of chemicals out there, we just don't know what they do or how they interact with our bodies or the environment. And in biodiversity, scientists estimate we're losing at least 10,000 species a year. And that's a very low conservative estimate based on how little we know about our ecosystems. The second point under challenges is that despite this alarming picture, people really devalue environmental issues when they're asked to rank them against other issues that they care about. So last year, Gallup ran its annual poll about climate change beliefs. And according to that poll, about half of Americans thought climate change is already underway, and another 29% believe it hasn't started, but it's going to happen in the near future. Not all those people think that it's driven by human causes, but that's a pretty solid majority that accepts this is happening. In another 2012 poll, though, Gallup asked respondents to prioritize various political issues. Only 21% of respondents thought that combating environmental issues such as global warming was an extremely important priority. This was tied with taxing the rich as the lowest priority in the list that people were asked to review. I mean, it fell below things like fighting terrorism and protecting social security, but it also was lower than setting high moral standards for our nation, which came in at 36%, and reducing corruption in the federal government, which came in at 45%. So for whatever reason, across this country, these are not issues that have been prioritized. And because we're not prioritizing them, my third point, our elected officials feel no pressure to make progress. So recently there's been a lot of talk about congressional inaction. I was there in the last Congress, which has now been determined to be the least productive Congress since Truman. And I think that's when they began measuring, so it could be worse than that. But an impasse on environmental issues is really nothing new. That's not something that's just happened in the last couple of years. The last major federal environmental legislation was passed in 1990. So most of the students in the room here, in your entire lifetimes, Congress has not done anything significant to tackle environmental issues. And that's a devastating commentary on where we rank these issues and what we're telling our elected officials we want done. This means that federal agencies are trying to address new and emerging threats with old laws, and in many cases they're getting struck down by courts who say this isn't what Congress meant by that law when they wrote it 30, 40 years ago. And so we're running out of tools to address some serious problems. Meanwhile, there are corporations that like the status quo and have worked to keep the status quo. There are also corporations that want to move but won't. they're keeping their capital on the sidelines because they see no clear market signals. We've not decided where we're going, and so they're not going to make the investments that need to be made to go forward until somebody tells them what direction we're headed. So these are huge challenges. We really need a sea change to address them. We need all disciplines, all skills to make progress in what I see are 3 broad areas. So I'm going to talk about these 3 areas, and then I was going to wrap up, and if people had questions or wanted to talk about things, happy to do that, talk a little bit more about my career or whatever. But the 3 areas are, we need to be more creative in how we design environmental regulation. We need to incorporate environmental sustainability into regular business practices. And we need to broaden our definition of what it means to be an environmentalist. So first, we need to be creative in how we design environmental regulation. I loved being an environmental litigator. I litigated in the environmental enforcement section of justice for 7 years, and I was EPA's attorney. I didn't know this, so if you guys know this, and I'm belaboring this point, but I didn't know this till my 3rd year of law school, that EPA has a lot of lawyers, and they do administrative work, but if and when you get to the point where a company just won't comply with the law and you want to file a lawsuit in federal court, you turn it over to the Department of Justice. So that was the role that I played. And I loved the work, and I found it really very meaningful and exciting, and met a whole host of different kinds of corporations and characters. But one of the things I noticed in my time at DOJ was how many things had to go wrong before a company was being sued in federal court. I mean, sometimes the company was outright recalcitrant. They just had no intent of ever following the law, and they just had hedged their bets that they weren't ever going to be litigated or enforced against. But that really, company behavior only described part of the problem. Many times the law was unclear, or EPA had failed to enforce the law for so long that there was just rampant noncompliance, and did you really want to be the company, like the one company that's following the law when no one else is, and they're getting an economic advantage by moving forward without pollution controls? You didn't want to look like the idiot, so you kind of went along. So one of the reasons that I left litigation and went into policy is that I wanted to move further up that pipeline and find those systemic problems that sort of make it too easy not to comply with the law. Once you do that, you figure out how rational companies come to violate environmental laws, and you take away those systemic sort of glide paths that make it too easy for them. Then you can focus on the bad apples with enforcement. Tough regulation and enforcement is really important. You've got to punish some actors and deter others from behaviors that harm the environment and compromise human health. And in fact, I'm launching an enforcement initiative with the New England office, the Boston-based office of EPA. We're convening students and policy makers over a series of 2 years to figure out new creative ways to enforce the law given today's realities. Smaller enforcement budgets, but emerging new information technologies and figuring out how we can get citizens more involved in monitoring and using more handheld measuring devices and not waiting for some sort of grant to have $500,000 to buy a new air monitor and things like that. So I'm very excited about that. But environmental regulation by fiat and tough enforcement isn't always the most effective way to guide environmentally sustainable behavior. It really has to be treated as the backstop, sort of the last resort and not the only resort. I recently read this article by a Brooklyn Law School professor called Structural Laws and the Puzzle of Regulating Behavior, and I know probably a lot of you don't sit around reading law review articles, and most of them are awful, so I can totally understand that, but this one I thought was really interesting. And he wrote, while regulating by statutory commands alone may be the easiest and most obvious method of regulating behavior, it is not the only option. There's also something called structural laws. Structural laws establish mechanisms or procedures that push citizens toward compliance, or corporations, towards compliance by making the undesirable behavior less profitable or more troublesome. They far more effectively regulate large populations, promote the development of social norms, and confine the need for enforcement to a much smaller subset of determined lawbreakers. And one of the examples he used was the mailbox, the blue mailbox you see on sidewalks. There are federal, it's a federal crime to tamper with mail. And of course, there are still places you could find mail and tamper with it. But when somebody puts a letter in a blue mailbox, just because of the way the mailbox is designed, you have to really want to get a letter in there and destroy it. I mean, there's I don't even know how you would do it, some sort of like periscope and hook, and you probably bring out a lot of letters that were not the one you wanted to destroy. And so that's sort of a way that you use structural methods to, yes, there's this backup where it says like, you're not allowed to tamper with mail or you could go to jail. But so few people get to that point because it's just really hard to get into the mailbox. There are some limited examples of this in the environmental world, but a lot of really interesting work could be done in this area. Two environmental examples. One is taxing pollution. Taxing acid rain is one way to just make the behavior less profitable, and you drive companies to want to try to find technologies to reduce that pollution so they don't have to pay for it. Also back in the 1970s when we had leaded gasoline and we were moving to unleaded gasoline, the newer cars had these different gas cap designs, so you literally couldn't put the leaded gasoline gas into your car. And so rather than just say don't do it, it was easier to make it where someone physically couldn't do it, or they could do it but with a whole lot of work. So I really recommend this. I think would be a really interesting field to kind of get into, of how you sort of get companies to do the right thing by not only having those backstop regulations, but then designing systems that make it just way easier for them to do the right thing and super hard and annoying and expensive to do the wrong thing. My second proposed path forward is incorporating environmental sustainability into regular business practice. So even if we got more creative about how we regulate business activities, we still can't cover the waterfront with legal systems. Not if we want to live in a free society, not if we have private enterprise. So we're going to have to supplement those systems with the development and acceptance of social norms that just make it unacceptable not to incorporate environmental sustainability in your business practices. You've got to make it second nature. So this is another, I think, really promising and creative area where a lot of psychologists and anthropologists have gotten into this work of how you develop green social norms. And so some of you may have heard of Robert Cialdini at Arizona State. He's done these really interesting projects. One of his most well-known was in 2008. He and a colleague from the University of Minnesota published research they had done in an Arizona hotel. So you may have noticed at hotels they've got those little signs that say, in different forms, please consider reusing your towel. Every year we spend this much money and use this much water to do our laundry. It'd be really great if you reused your towel. So he decided, maybe we should frame that request in different ways and put it in different rooms and see what happens. And so, all the signs had some sort of please reuse your towel, to help save the environment. And in every room, some people did this. So there's some hope that, there are people just, generally want to do this. But when the sign said most people reuse their towels at least once during their stay, the reuse percentage went up 26%. And when the sign said most people who have stayed in this room have reused their towel at least once, it went up 33%. So it was this really powerful example of people like to do the right thing. They like to do what everybody else is doing. It makes them feel accepted in their society. So the trick is, how do we make it that it's acceptable and not, and to do environmental things, and unacceptable not to. People are really sophisticated at picking up these cues too, and it can happen really quickly. And I have sort of a depressing example of this, but I volunteered with the Sierra Club Inner City Outings when I lived in Washington, D.C., where you take kids who live in the city and don't get to interact with nature that much, and we take them hiking. So, I went with a busload of kids to the George Washington National Forest, and as soon as we got there, we ate, and then we sort of handed out granola bars and started walking. And in my little group, there was a brother-sister pair. She was maybe about 9 years old, and he was 7, and he ate his granola bar pretty quickly and dropped it on the ground. So we've been off the bus at this point 25 minutes. These kids have never been outside of their neighborhood, because we talked about that when we were on the bus. And as soon as her brother dropped his wrapper on the ground, the sister went running over and said, "You have to pick that up. Haven't you noticed nobody drops trash here?" And so it was this really interesting thing of it's probably a sad commentary that people do throw trash where she lives, and that's why he might do that, but there was this recognition of, I've already noticed no one else does this here. And so these are really powerful human instincts that I think we could do a lot of work with. And as these green social norms emerge, we can and should demand that they apply to corporations as well. every single one of us will play two roles in our lives. No matter what else you do in your life, you will be a citizen and you will be a consumer. And both of those are incredibly important roles, and you should wield the power that they bring very carefully, because they really can drive behavior, particularly if you work together in those roles and sort of add to your power. In addition, some of us will work for corporations, and when we do, we have to make sure we don't check our ethics, environmental or otherwise, at the door. I found this speech on active citizenship by Dean Hollister of Tisch College online, and he had this quote that I really liked. It was, "Lives of active citizenship are not a string of episodic acts, rather they are a journey, a lifelong experience and quest, a process of trying out new approaches and of rethinking and learning. Out of this comes a philosophy that members of a corporation or a country or a university may never take off their citizen hats and must consider impact, social and environmental, on the collective that flows from their actions." So whenever we are at work, wherever that is, whatever it looks like, we should be incorporating these values. And if there are these social norms, these green social norms emerging, we should make sure we bring them with us to work. Others of us may follow a more traditional environmental path, and if you do, you'll be more effective if you engage with corporations and try to get them to incorporate these green social norms, but starting from an appreciation of the legal frameworks that they operate in. I mean, this is always true. If you understand who it is you're talking to and you understand what their constraints are, and you can somehow define action within those constraints, you're so much more likely to find allies and move forward and foster change. The senator that I worked for, I always like to talk about the story of a senator that had been the senator from Rhode Island in his seat before him. We like to give him a lot of advice. Claiborne Pell, this guy was a character. There's a biography out about him now. He used to run around Capitol Hill in his seersucker suit at age 85. He would jog around the Capitol every day. Total nut. But one of his quotes was, "Always let the other fella have it your way." And that's I think a brilliant way of going through life. Figure out what the other person wants and then fit it in where you want them to go. In law school, I had this gestalt moment in my corporations class. Why I took corporations class? At that point, I was incredibly anti-corporation, assumed they were all anti-environmental. But I took this class, and we read this case. It was a 1919 Michigan case called Dodge v. Ford. Has anybody ever heard of this case? It's super fascinating. So this is Henry Ford has his car company. There are these two guys on his board, the Dodge brothers, and he's a little concerned that they're thinking of taking their dividends and going and starting a rival company. So he decides, rather than giving out dividends this year, we're just going to reinvest all the money back into the company. We're going to expand facilities so we can employ more people, and we're going to raise wages because living wages are good. And if we have employees that make more money and are stable, they'll be good employees for us, and they'll also buy our cars, and it'll be this great thing. So, I mean, he had this ulterior motive where he was worried about what the Dodges were up to, but, he was saying, I like living wages, I want to expand employment. Well, his board took him to court, and he lost because the Supreme Court of Michigan said that a corporation exists to maximize profit for its shareholders. And, that still stands. There are ways around that, including if you are someone who can work really well with your board and your board understands where you're headed, you can avoid those kinds of lawsuits. But at the end of the day, that is a major reason for corporations to exist. And so for me, it went from thinking that they were anti-environmental to realizing they were just neutral on environmental issues. And if I could make the case that acting in a more sustainable way would maximize their profit, many of them will listen. So in 1994, there was a sustainability consultant in Britain who coined the term triple bottom line. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's arguing that companies need to consider profits, people, and the planet to fully account for costs and benefits of their decisions. This helped set the stage for broadening corporate perspective, but in my view, it still was sort of requiring companies to do the right thing and sort of, perhaps even at cost of maximizing profit, at least under traditional accounting methods. What I think is more promising is that there's a lot of work being done now to make the economic case for sustainability, that there are reasons why environmentally sustainable practices will also help that first bottom line, the profit, that it reduces costs because you're reducing waste or water use or energy use. It boosts employee retention. There's been some interesting studies that people feel more loyal to their company if their company is pro-environmental or ethical or has them do volunteer work, or it feels like it's, your job is more in line with your own personal beliefs, and so you're more willing to stay and be more productive. It boosts brand loyalty. People feel good about buying products that are good on the environment. And it can forestall regulation. I mean, sometimes, people will not ask for a law to be made, or Congress may not feel like it needs to if it looks like the problem's being solved this way. And there's something I recently read, this is book, the name of it just will make you fall asleep, but the Oxford Handbook of Managerial Economics. But there was this really interesting chapter in it, and they were making the distinction between corporate social responsibility, which you guys were talking about at the beginning, and strategic corporate social responsibility, and trying to figure out how to put more things in that second basket where you're sort of playing to corporate self-interest and making it, you can maybe have, if you can pitch to them that working in these ways not only is good for the planet, but also is good for them. They can make these strategic decisions and have a win-win outcome. Now, I'm not Pollyanna, so I know some of you are probably like, corporate self-interest only gets you so far. And it's certainly true that corporate self-interest can be served by greenwashing or astroturf politics. We have to really be vigilant about that and root out superficial environmental gestures that mask unsustainable practices. But I really believe that many companies are starting to recognize that environmental sustainability is the right thing to do. And when I was working on the climate bill in the Senate, I found it intriguing and sort of heartening to see that there were a number of major companies walking out of the Chamber of Commerce at that time because they were really angry at the Chamber taking this position that we shouldn't ever do anything about climate change. So you had like Pacific Gas and Electric and Caterpillar and Nike making the case publicly on the Hill about what was going to happen in their supply chains, what was going to happen to coastal infrastructure, what if we allowed greenhouse gases to continue to be emitted at this rate, and if we had climate change. So there's potential there to make a shift happen. And also, just as a little afterthought, recognizing legal constraints doesn't mean accepting them. So I have a really good friend who works for this company called B Corporation, and you can find them online, bcorporation.net. And they are working, going state to state to create laws that allow you to establish B corporations or benefit corporations. And they, by law, have to maximize benefits to not only their shareholders, but also to their workers in the community. And so if you create this new construct, and then they also have they do a lot of work driving companies to that new model, and that's a way of changing this as well. My last point, and I think it's the shortest one, is just that we need to broaden our definition of environmentalist. I feel like the environmental movement has become professional, and that's good because we've got full-time attention on issues. We've got people with professional skills trying to solve environmental problems. But the negative side to this is that sometimes we define environmentalists too narrowly as just the experts or as just the purists, and then we deny every human being's right to and interest in a clean and healthy environment. And I just task you, it's kind of interesting sometimes to just read newspaper articles and see how many times the word environmentalist is in there, and it really should read human being instead. Things like, I just read one, it was environmentalists still waiting for Obama to act on climate change. It's like, I don't think it's just this little professional cadre waiting for him. Maybe the polar bears are waiting too, and lots of other creatures. So, this small cadre, though, can't do it alone. We need to really broaden our movement. And, one of the things I normally like to talk about, but it's not really a focus here, I'll just make a little point here, is that it's so important to draw the links between environmental degradation and human rights abuses, poverty, political instability, national security. So you should be finding allies in those places. This should never be a human rights or environment issue. This shouldn't be a unions or environmentalist issue. We've working on climate change and clean air issues on the Hill. The military was a huge ally for us because they saw climate change as a real threat. You should always be looking for these sort of interesting angles because they already exist. We just need to start talking about them and making sure we work together like that. But we also need to see corporations as potential environmentalists. I really think our only hope of shifting to a sustainable global economy is to push, pull, or invite corporations to come along with us. And that does also mean to withdraw support from some of those that just refuse to evolve. But we need to kind of bring as many of them along as we can. And that's when I was a litigator at EPA, I really always tried to get the best deal for EPA, and I saw that as sort of twofold. In the short term, I wanted to get the most pollution reductions and the highest penalty possible. But long term, I wanted to make sure I did it in a way that got buy-in from the company. If I beat them over the head and made them feel awful or made them hate me, I mean, they're going to walk out the door and just out of spite go and violate the law again. We want to make people, there's a way to be tough and to get good deals from people or to negotiate with companies in a way that actually gets them to internalize the issue you're talking about and not just make them sort of push away from you and get defensive, because you just don't get anywhere that way. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I just, the challenges are enormous and there's no silver bullet, but I think that that's a good thing. There's lots of different ways that we can move forward and that we must move forward. There's lots of different allies, there's lots of different skills that are needed in this, and I just challenge everyone to find their particular way of incorporating environmental sustainability into whatever it is you do.
First of all, thank you so much for that. That was really inspiring. I love hearing about all the different avenues one can be an environmentalist. You mentioned before that some companies, are interested in kind of setting that environmental standard, but are reticent to be the first and, to follow regulations. What would be your advice to a company that's looking to be an industry leader in that sense?
That's a good question. I mean, so for instance, electric utilities are fascinating. I really have had a really interesting relationship with them. I, as a DOJ litigator, was in incredibly contentious litigation against a lot of the largest coal-fired utilities in the country to try to get them to put on scrubbers and things. And then I found myself working with some of those same companies when I was on the Hill trying to do a climate bill and then trying to respond to clean energy and clean air policy. And some of the utilities really are poised because they have already diversified their portfolios, they believe in renewables, both from an environmental standpoint, but also because it really helps them with reliability to have distributed generation. With all these huge storms we've been having on the East Coast, it's actually easier to keep the lights on if you have energy sources in lots of different areas. It's also just been helpful for them to, a lot of states have new laws now, renewable portfolio standards and efficiency targets, and so a lot of these utilities had already kind of started this work and were underway, and they were some of the ones that were really stuck in this position where, in the national scene, do they go build the gigantic wind farm when the subsidy's about to run out, the federal tax credit, and they don't know if that's ever going to get redone? Where do they site the wind farm because transmission is falling apart in this country and nobody wants to build new lines yet until they wait to see what Congress is going to do, what big market signal we're sending about the types of energy we want to build and use. And one of the things, and I can't say that it was my suggestion, they'd already started doing some of this organizing, but I worked very closely with this group called the Clean Energy Group while I was on the Hill. And basically, because my answer was that they had to band together and make this business case for moving forward. And so it was a group of electric utilities that represent more than half of electricity consumers in this country who took very strong public stands in defense of EPA Clean Air Act rulemaking, in defense of renewable energy tax credits, because that was our response was, I can kind of understand why you don't want to make a multi-million or billion-dollar investment in transmission and generation when you don't know what's going to happen with the market, but you have a large enough voice and a different voice from the environmentalists to make this case. It still remains to be seen if that works, but a lot of the companies took that seriously and have been trying to do that. So.
What has been the most frustrating thing for you, I guess, a little more personally working, or I guess trying to work with corporations?
What's the most frustrating? I think, and I guess I'm thinking most particularly about my time on the Hill, but frankly, there were always sort of political dynamics going on in the background of in litigation as well. I am frustrated by the lack of a multi-party system in this country to really debate the tough issues. And I think that as long as one party stands completely on the sidelines on these issues and decides they don't exist, it's all too easy for companies to cop out and not engage. And a lot of them are not. A lot of them are trying to engage, but the House Energy and Commerce Committee, when it flipped to Republican 2 years ago, now going on 3, I mean, they made a concerted effort, and every time they had a hearing about environmental issues and they had companies come in to talk about it, they would ignore everyone else and would focus only on the companies and just embarrass the witnesses and beat them down, make people cry, and the message was, we don't want companies here talking about these things. And so that was frustrating to me. I feel like there's just such a chilling effect right now when you've only got 2 parties and one party doesn't believe there's pollution or that the climate change is happening, or I think we're doing ourselves a real disservice that we're not getting past those sort of silly first preliminary questions and getting into the very, very tough issues that remain. How do we do this? How do we tackle these problems? And I think companies, a lot of times they would kind of work with you for a little while, but then, I mean, they know the numbers in Congress as well, and they know that they don't have to do a whole lot and work with you on this great new third way because the other guys aren't going to go along with it, and it's easier just to stick with the status quo. So there were that was very frustrating.
So first off, thank you for your remarks and congratulations on your award.
Thank you.
You spoke a bit about the structural policy changes that need to be enacted in order to ensure environmental responsibility. Do you feel that cap and trade legislation and policies need to be integrated or need to be a part of that, or are you sort of dubious about their effectiveness?
You know, it's tough. I was working on that legislation. I feel like something would be better than nothing right now. But cap and trade worries me a little bit. In that there were so many off-ramps, so many ways to report your emissions, there were so many ways to buy offsets. It was unclear, and that was something that Senator Whitehouse was very concerned about, and I worked very closely on his behalf with the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee on, was how do you make sure that those are real offsets, that they're additional, that somebody's making sure this project is actually taking place. It seemed like it got so complicated, at least that cap and trade system as designed, that it didn't have that, what I was talking about with the structural. There were too many ways, or it'd be too easy to either get confused because it's super complicated, or if you wanted to game the system, which is, there's probably better ways to design it, but it got very unwieldy and had lots of exceptions and off-ramps, and I think that would have been difficult to achieve compliance. One of the good things, though, I mean, so acid rain has actually been, it is the one program, if you ask EPA, that they actually know their compliance status of everyone who's regulated, and it's a pretty high compliance. EPA either has no idea who's complying with their laws, or they know, and they know they're not complying at a very high level. And one of the things that's great about the acid rain program is that as part of it, every single coal-fired, fossil fuel-fired utility in the country has a continuous emissions monitoring system on its top. So you know in real time what's coming out. And they do track CO2 now too. So for those larger sources, cap and trade would work, because everybody can look online and see in real time what's coming out of those stacks. It's where it gets tough is the smaller facilities that don't have that on.
So I think it was in the New York Times, I got it online, and I don't recall. There was a story about the worst supermarkets in the nation, and they were ranked. And unfortunately, 2 of the 10 were here in New England. But the point I'm trying to make is that the guidelines were 4 categories, like cleanliness and service, so forth and so on, and degree of freshness in produce and so forth. and it was these categories were investigated by Consumer Reports, an objective third party. So that's going to probably be across all of the print newspapers tomorrow, and people are going to be very interested in that. And I wouldn't be surprised, and we've already seen in my neighborhoods where Shaw's, which was one of the top, is now on the bottom. Okay, and it's obvious when you go in and see these things. The point I'm trying to make is that can there be a set of standards like they were just established for the supermarkets per industry and reported on, and corporations can get a value of that standard as a part of their Standard & Poor's rating or their financial ratings. So if people want to invest in a corporation, or investors or other corporations want to buy a company, they look at the financial rating of that company and all that that is comprised of. Why not have an additional category in terms of a company's environmental responsibility?
I think that's a great idea. Standards do work. They're very effective when they're clear. And there's been some concern about some of the environmental certification programs that get too nuanced, too in the weeds. But if you stick with things like cleanliness, produce, freshness of produce, things that people understand, immediately can respond to, they can play an incredibly important role. Disclosure generally can be a very powerful tool. California has a state law that requires non-food products to have the ingredients listed. And when that first happened, the number of manufacturers that went and figured out how to get things like formaldehyde out of their products because they didn't want to put that on the list was remarkable. SEC now does, I don't think it's a requirement yet, but there's guidance out about including some of your environmental practices and your vulnerabilities to climate change and having that included in your Securities and Exchange Commission filings. But having a really clear reporting system that then was baked into that process would be incredibly important. We should talk more about that. Yes.
Can you explain what's just happened with the article that you've written on fracking? What's going on?
Sure. So I was charged with, when I started the Environmental Policy Center at Harvard Law School, I was charged with finding issues that are contentious and digging into places where perhaps deeper legal analysis could help move the discussion along. And so fracking is quite contentious and there's a lot going on. So what I decided to do, and I worked with two students who did an amazing job and have authorship recognition as well. We looked at all the states that have, this is actually a good transition, have disclosure requirements about the chemicals that are being used at oil and gas wells. Of the 18 states that do require some disclosure, 11 of them direct companies just to make their reporting on a third-party industry-run website. And so we thought, this could be a really interesting model. If it turns out, the industry had initially set this website up as a voluntary response to concern about chemical use. So that seemed promising, and the fact that it was on a website and meant that it was accessible to people, because a lot of times states get these filings and they go sit in a dusty drawer and nobody actually ever sees them. So we initially started at thinking this could be an interesting model. It's like a good private-public partnership that public agencies don't have resources right now. They can just direct you to this other website that's run by industry, and all of us can go to this website and get this information. And what we were finding was that while it's probably good as a voluntary registry, it is not serving the purpose of a regulatory reporting tool. There's no quality control, and we found, from well to well, the same product. Sometimes 2 ingredients are listed, and they're not particularly noxious ingredients. Other wells, the same product by the same manufacturer. It's clearly the same. Has 18 ingredients, and some of them are very concerning. trade secrets are sometimes asserted, sometimes not, and you actually, as you go through this thing, you can't do searches across the database, so this was incredibly painstaking. You have to open up one PDF file at a time on each well, and so we ended up going and finding an engineering student to help us figure out how to get all the data and actually put it in a database where we could search across. And so we just made the point that states and now the federal government is proposing, disclosure requirements, so clearly people are taking this seriously and think this is a good social goal. Companies are taking a lot of time filling out these forms, but it's not serving the purpose. It's incomplete, it has lots and lots of errors. These chemical CIS numbers that the American Chemical Society attaches to each chemical to make sure it's unique identifier. A third of those CIS numbers on the Texas wells that we looked at don't exist. So it's just not serving its purpose. And so we made that case without we had some recommendations at the end, but it was mostly just a very legally robust, pouring through state fracking laws, state public information laws, because the other thing is when a state says, oh, just go send the information to a third-party registry, the state public information laws no longer apply because the state never takes possession of the information. So if you want to find out about more information beyond this PDF about what's going on in a well site that's on your property or near your property, you've lost now the opportunity to go to the state to ask for more information or to challenge a trade secret assertion because the state never takes possession of the information. And we didn't think that states maybe had realized that they had ceded that authority, so we made that case, and the response has been pretty extraordinary, very quickly. We dropped it at 7 o'clock this morning, and it was the lead story on Energy Wire, which is one of the big green reporting wires. USA Today has been tweeting about it all day today. I've interviewed with Platts, with Bloomberg, with Denver Post, several others on my phone now. So it's it's a 10-page thing. It's this little, very straightforward little, these are the things we found, but it's that kind of, that's the other thing. It's amazing, so few people take the time to dig into things and learn the details, and so often you'll find in articles there are just these assertions made, and when you go and look, there's actually nothing, there's no primary source that ever backs that up. People just start saying what they hear everyone else saying. And so the power of just digging in and finding these details can be remarkable.
Do you think it's feasible that there ever will be some sort of, centralized standard or database? Maybe I'm hearing a lot of there's a lot of efficiency loss in regulations and standards and corporate practices, maybe even within an industry. Do you think that that's something we might see in our lifetime, or is that just way too big of a task to undertake?
No, and actually that's one of the things that EPA Region 1 has asked us to take a look at with them. Some of the states in EPA Region 1, Massachusetts, I think, and Connecticut are pioneers in, it's still very new, but just the process of having databases that speak to the state databases and making sure that a company could go to a portal and make one reporting, fill out one report, and that all the relevant information would end up in the right agencies and in interfaces with the public. It would make it easier for the company, and it would make the whole thing a lot more transparent, cutting down on enforcement costs, engaging the public in oversight of company practices. And so EPA Region 1, because they already had 2 states in their midst that have started to do this, has decided to make this one of their major goals. And so that's one of the things they've asked us to work with on them and with them. And in fact, one of the first projects we're going to do with a series of students is just go to these states. We'll probably start in Massachusetts because we're here, and make the case, show what's happened since they've started this, because it's still very incomplete. But if we can start to show, demonstrate successes, then it helps raise the profile for this, get them money in their budget for this, get buy-in from companies. We can figure out if there's resistance and how can we work to address that. So yeah, no, I'm very hopeful. It's amazing how far behind agencies are in that, but I think that holds a lot of promise.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Kate.
Yeah.
Thank you.